That's not a racing driver. That's a publicity stunt with a helmet on. And he just put my car in the wall." Victor Kane set it into a paddock full of cameras, while Damon Ellis climbed out of a smoking car he had done everything humanly possible to keep off the barrier. The car had lost its brakes at 200 miles an hour, and Damon had wrestled it down from certain catastrophe to a survivable impact through pure hands and nerve. And the first thing waiting for him when he pulled off his helmet was the principal of his own team telling the world it was his fault. "I lost the brakes, Victor," Damon said, keeping his voice level in front of the microphones. "The pedal went to the floor. That's a failure, not a driver error. Pull the telemetry." Victor Kane laughed the way rich men laugh to make a thing disappear. "The telemetry says what I say it says. And what I say is, we took a chance on a feel-good story. A kid from nowhere, because the sponsors liked the picture and the story just cost us a race car." He turned to the press. Because humiliation was a performance, and he loved an audience. Real drivers come up through the academies, through families that have been in this sport for generations, not off some street circuit in a neighborhood you'd lock your doors driving through. We made an exception. Lesson learned. A rival driver smirked, and Damon Ellis stood in his fireproof suit, heart still going from a brush with death, and understood that the man who owned his career had just decided in public to make him the villain of a crash. Damon was now almost certain someone had arranged. He did not know that Sloan Whitaker, whose late father had founded the team Kane now ran, had been standing at the back of the garage and had already pulled the raw telemetry herself, and was looking at a brake pressure trace that told a very different story than the one Kane was selling. To understand what was done to Damon Ellis, you have to understand where his hands came from. And his hands came from a garage under an elevated train line, where his uncle rebuilt engines for a living and let a skinny silent kid hang around and learn. Damon had not grown up around racing. He had grown up around cars, which is a different, and in some ways deeper thing, cars that had to be kept alive on no-money cars that were fixed with feel and improvisation because there was never the right part or the money to buy it. His uncle, a man named Ray, who could diagnose a misfire by resting 2 fingers on a valve cover, had taught Damon the thing that would make him unlike every other driver he would ever race against, which was that Damon did not experience a car as a driver experiences it from the outside as a machine to be operated. He experienced it as a mechanic experiences it from the inside as a living system. He could feel breathing. He could tell its speed the exact moment a tire began to give up the precise character of a vibration. The difference between a car that was slow because of setup and a car that was slow because something was wrong. He was not just a fast driver. He was a driver who was also in his hands and his inner ear one of the best engineers in the sport. And that combination was so rare that the few people who understood it knew it was worth a championship. He came up the hard way, the only way open to him, which was street circuits and grassroots karting and racing. Anything with wheels for prize money, sleeping in vans, rebuilding his own equipment, because he could not afford a crew winning. Always winning, because talent that raw eventually becomes impossible to ignore even by a sport built to ignore it. He had no academy, no family money, no pedigree, none of the things that were supposed to be prerequisites, and he had beaten again and again the kids who had all of them. And the beating had earned him exactly one thing, a seat finally in a real professional team, the team that Victor Kane ran. It should have been the beginning. It was a trap. Because Damon had not been signed by a man who believed in him. He had been signed by a man who needed him. The Whitaker team was in trouble. Its founder, old Arthur Whitaker, a genuine racer who had built the team out of love, had died 3 years before, and control had passed to Victor Kane, his former business partner, who ran it now as a machine for his own enrichment and ego. The team had sponsors who had begun in the modern way to demand that it look like it cared about the world beyond its narrow, wealthy circle, and Kane had signed Damon Ellis. Not because Damon was one of the most talented drivers on earth, which he was, but because Damon's story, the kid from under the train line, made the sponsors happy and the marketing easy. Damon was to Victor Kane a photograph, and Kane had every intention of making sure the photograph never actually threatened the driver Kane truly cared about, which was the team's golden boy, its number one, a smooth, well-financed, pedigreed young man named Chase Ashworth, whose family had been in the sport for 3 generations, and whose father sat on the same boards as Victor Kane. So Kane built the trap that talented outsiders are always caught in. He gave Damon the seat, and then made sure Damon could not win in it. The two cars on a team are supposed to be equal. Damon's never was. He got the older specification parts, the engine on higher mileage, the setup time cut short the strategy calls that always seemed to go against him. The upgrades that arrived on Chase's car 3 races before they arrived on his. It was all deniable, all explicable, all buried in the 1,000 technical decisions a team makes, and its effect was precise to make Damon Ellis, one of the fastest men alive, look like a driver who could not quite deliver. So that when the season ended and Kane declined to renew the Feel Good Stories contract, the numbers would justify it, and no one would ask why. For most drivers, it would have worked because most drivers cannot tell the difference between a car that is slow because of them and a car that is slow because of the team. Damon could. That was the thing Victor Kane had failed to account for, the same way Reeve and Pierce and all of them failed to account for the one thing their victims actually had. Damon had spent his childhood under a train line learning to feel exactly what was wrong with a car. And he knew race after race with an engineer's certainty that his machine was being compromised and he could not prove it because the data belonged to the team and the team belonged to Victor Kane. Until the brakes. The brake failure at 200 miles an hour was the moment the trap went too far, because there is a difference between giving a driver an inferior car and giving a driver a dangerous one, and someone on the team had crossed it. Damon knew the instant the pedal went to the floor that this was not wear, not a driver pushing too hard. This was a failure that should not have been possible on a professionally prepared car. And when Victor Kane stood in front of the cameras and blamed him for it, Damon understood that he was no longer in a fight for a contract. He was in a fight for his life, and possibly for whether he would be alive to have one. Sloane Whitaker had understood it before he had. Sloane was Arthur Whitaker's daughter, 32, and she had grown up in the team in the real one, the one her father built out of love before Victor Kane turned it into a machine. She had spent her childhood in garages the way Damon had spent his under the train line, and though she had gone away to study and had trained as an engineer, she had come back after her father died because the team was the last of him, and she could not bear to watch Kane hollow it out. She held a minority stake her father had left her and a title that gave her access but not control, and she had spent 3 years watching Victor Kane run her father's team into the ground of his own greed, unable to stop him learning the machine from the inside, waiting for the thing that would finally give her the leverage to take it back. She had noticed Damon Ellis before anyone told her to. She had noticed him the way an engineer notices another engineer because she watched the data, and the data told her a story the paddock did not. She could see in the telemetry that the kid from under the train line was doing things with an inferior car that should not have been possible, that his raw pace corrected for the equipment he was given was the best on the team and possibly the best in the series, that Victor Kane had signed a generational talent as a photograph and was systematically wasting him. And she had watched the brake failure with an engineer's eye, and while Victor Kane performed for the cameras, Sloane Whitaker had gone quietly to the data and pulled the raw brake pressure trace before anyone thought to lock it down, and what she saw made her hands go cold. The trace showed the brakes failing, not gradually, the way brakes fail from wear, but suddenly cleanly in a way that pointed not to a component reaching the end of its life, but to a component that had been made to fail. She was not certain yet, but she was certain enough to save the data to make a copy Victor Kane did not know existed, and to go find the driver everyone else in the paddock was busy blaming. She found him in the quiet after in the corner of the garage, where he had gone to be alone with the wreck of his own car, running his hands over the brake assembly the way his Uncle Ray had taught him, reading it with his fingers. It didn't wear out, Damon said without looking up because he had already read with his hands what Sloane had read in the data. Brakes don't fail like this. Somebody helped it. I know, Sloane said. I have the trace, the raw one before Kane's people touch it. She crouched down beside him, and for the first time, Damon looked at her, really looked, and saw not the owner's daughter he had assumed her to be, but an engineer with an engineer's eyes looking at the same wrongness he was looking at and seeing the same thing. I've been watching your data all season, Damon. I know what they've been doing to your car, the old parts, the cut setup time, the strategy calls. I couldn't prove it was deliberate because everything they did was deniable. But this isn't deniable. This is a brake assembly that was made to fail at the worst place on the calendar, and Victor Kane stood in front of the world 20 minutes later and blamed you for it, which means either he did it or he's protecting whoever did. She held his gaze. My father built this team. Victor Kane is turning it into something my father would have burned it down before he allowed. I have been waiting 3 years for the thing that would let me take it back from him. I think you just survived it. So I'm going to ask you to trust an owner's daughter you have no reason to trust, because I don't think either of us can do this alone." Damon looked at her for a long moment. This woman crouched in the wreckage, speaking the language of his uncle's garage, and he made the decision that changes everything, whether to protect himself with silence or to trust the one person on the inside who had come to him with the truth in her hands. "They think I'm a photograph," he said quietly. "Kane signed a photograph. He forgot the photograph came up under a train line taking apart engines that were trying to kill people, and that I can feel exactly what's wrong with a car, and now I can feel exactly what's wrong with this team." He set the brake assembly down. "You want to take your father's team back from the man who's poisoning it. I want to race the way I know I can race in a car nobody's rigged against me, and I want the man who put me in that wall to answer for it." He held out a hand black with brake dust. "I think we want the same thing. Let's find out who did it." Sloan shook the dusty hand, and the war began. It was a slow, careful, dangerous war because Victor Kane held all the power, the team, the data, the money, the relationships, and Sloan and Damon had only the truth in a copy of a telemetry trace in each other. They could not accuse Kane openly. An unproven accusation of sabotage would end Damon's career and give Kane every excuse to remove Sloan from the team on grounds of disloyalty, and worse, it would tip off whoever had prepared the brakes, who would then make very sure no evidence remained. So they did what people in their position have to do. They investigated in secret, and they waited for the season to hand them the moment when the truth could be made undeniable in front of an audience Victor Kane could not control. Sloan worked the inside. She had access, and she used it quietly, pulling maintenance records comparing the preparation logs of Damon's car against Chase's building. A documented pattern of the deniable sabotage across the whole season. The parts, the mileage, the setup time, and now the brakes. She was careful, meticulous, an engineer's daughter building an engineer's case, because she understood that against a man like Kane, you got one shot and it had to be airtight. And she began to identify who specifically had prepared the failed brake assembly, working back through the logs to a mechanic on Damon's car. A nervous, indebted man named Petro, who had the records showed, worked on the assembly on off schedule the night before the race, which no honest preparation ever required. Damon worked the car and the track, because here was the thing they both understood, that exposing the sabotage was necessary but not sufficient. Even if they proved Kane had given Damon an inferior car all season, Kane would simply say the numbers were the numbers and Damon had underperformed. The only way to destroy that lie completely was for Damon to do the thing the lie said he could not do, to win undeniably in front of everyone and take away Kane's story before they ever revealed the sabotage. So that when the truth came out, the whole world would already know exactly how good the man in the compromised car really was. So Damon drove for the rest of that season like a man possessed, extracting from his deliberately inferior machine results that made no engineering sense, dragging a car that was down on power and behind on upgrades into places it had no business being, podiums. It should not have reached a pace that the paddock began slowly to find impossible to explain. Because you cannot explain a driver going that fast in a car that measurably bad, except by the one explanation Victor Kane could not allow anyone to say out loud, that Damon Ellis was one of the greatest talents the sport had ever seen and was being wasted on purpose. And in the long grind of that secret war, Damon and Sloan fell in love the way people fall in love inside a shared fight over data and midnight garage sessions, and the slow accumulation of trust between two people who had each been alone with a truth no one else believed. It was not sudden. It was the way she learned to read his hands, and he learned to read her father in her, the racer's heart under the engineer's precision. It was the night they stayed until dawn in the data room, reconstructing the whole season's sabotage, and fell asleep against each other over a laptop full of proof. It was the way she started bringing him coffee, the way his Uncle Ray took it, because Damon had described the garage under the train line so often that Ray had become real to her. It was an argument about brake bias philosophy that turned without either of them steering it into the first time they kissed in an empty garage that smelled of fuel and rubber, surrounded by the evidence of everything that had been done to him. Neither of them said the word for it, because both of them had learned to distrust anything that came easy, and nothing about this was easy, and the man who owned her father's team and Damon's career would have ended both of them if he knew. There was a complication, and the complication was Chase Ashworth, the golden boy, the #1 driver, the pedigreed young man whose car always got the good parts. Damon had assumed for most of the season that Chase was in on it, a willing beneficiary of the rigged game. He was wrong, and the way he learned he was wrong became the turning point. Chase Ashworth was not, it turned out, a villain. He was something sadder and more useful, a decent but weak young man who had always been given the best of everything, and had never once had to ask whether he had earned it, and who had begun over the course of watching Damon drag an inferior car onto podiums to suspect the terrible truth about himself, that he was not actually the better driver, that he had only ever had the better car, and that the results he had built his whole identity on were a gift from Victor Kane and not an achievement of his own. It ate at him, and when the brake failure happened and Chase saw Kane blame Damon for a crash that Chase, who understood cars well enough, could see, was not Damon's fault. Something in the golden boy finally broke in the right direction. He came to Damon quietly ashamed and told him the truth, that he had known without letting himself know that his car was better, that he had heard Kane and the chief mechanic talking once about keeping the second car in its place, and that he did not know if Damon would believe him, but that he could not keep standing on a podium he had not earned while a better man was blamed for a crash he did not cause. It was not a heroic confession. It was a weak man finding late the edge of his own decency. But it gave Damon and Sloan the one thing they had been missing: a witness on the inside, someone who had heard Kane's people say it, and it turned a documented pattern into a case with a human voice. There was a low point. The way there always is a stretch in the middle of the season when the war nearly broke Damon. Victor Kane, sensing that his second driver had stopped behaving like a beaten man, escalated the psychological pressure in the deniable ways available to a team principal. He moved Damon's most trusted mechanic to Chase's car and replaced him with people loyal to Kane. He fed the friendly press small poisonous stories that Damon was difficult, that he blamed the team for his own errors, that the feel-good signing had become a locker room problem, so that the paddock narrative curdled around Damon exactly as Kane intended. He cut Damon's simulator time. He scheduled his media obligations to eat into his preparation. And after a race in which Damon had dragged the compromised car to a podium it had no right to reach, Kane stood in the debrief and in front of the whole team, credited the result entirely to the car and the strategy, and gave Damon nothing, rewriting the one undeniable thing Damon had done into a team achievement, so that even Damon's brilliance became evidence for Kane's story rather than against it. There was a night after that debrief when Damon sat alone in the dark of Ray's garage under the train line, back where it started, and came closer than he ever had to walking away. He thought that maybe the world was simply telling him, in the only language it spoke, what it had always told his kind, that they could do the work but never own it, that a man like Kane held every card and would always hold them, and that a wise man would take his hands somewhere they were wanted instead of throwing them against a door that would never open. And there was a door open to him, which was the temptation. A rival team had quietly approached him, a smaller operation, but an honest one, offering him a seat where his car would not be rigged against him, a clean way out of the whole war. It would have been the sane choice. It would also have meant leaving the Sabotage buried, leaving Victor Kane in possession of Arthur Whitaker's team, leaving whoever had made those brakes fail, free to do it to the next driver, and leaving Sloan alone on the inside of a fight she could not win by herself. Sloan came to the garage that night because she had learned the places his grief went, and she did not tell him to stay. She told him the truth, which was harder. "If you take the other seat, I won't blame you," she said, sitting down on an overturned crate in her father's old garage as a train rattled overhead. "You'd be alive and racing and free of him, and God knows you've earned that. But I need you to know what walking away means, because I'm not going to pretend it away to keep you. It means Kane keeps my father's team and turns it fully into the thing that nearly killed you. It means the mechanic who made those brakes fail does it again to whoever sits in that seat next. It means the story the world remembers is the one Kane told the photograph who couldn't deliver, because the only way that story ever gets corrected is if you stay and win in the car he rigged and make it impossible to tell any other way." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to stay for the team. I'm asking you to stay for the version of this sport where a kid from under a train line doesn't have to survive a man trying to kill his career to get through the door." You're the only person alive positioned to make that version real. But it cost you the sane choice, and I won't lie to you that it doesn't. Damon looked at her for a long time in the dark of Ray's garage. And then he made the choice that defined him, not the sane one, the right one, because he understood that if he took the clean seat, he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had left the door shut behind him for everyone who came after. Ray used to say, "You don't leave a job half-fixed just because it's hard to reach," he said finally. "You get the small wrench, and you get under there, and you finish it, because a thing half-fixed is worse than a thing untouched. It fails when someone's depending on it." He almost smiled. Kane's the thing that's hard to reach, so we get the small wrench. They were not alone in the end, and the allies mattered. There was an honest race engineer on Damon's car, a veteran named Frank Osei, who had worked for Arthur Whitaker in the old days and had stayed on through the Kane years with his jaw set and his conscience uneasy watching the team he loved be poisoned and unable to stop it. Frank had seen exactly what was being done to Damon's car, the old parts, the cut corners, and he had been documenting it quietly for 2 seasons in a private log, not out of any plan, but out of an engineer's need to keep an honest record, even when the team would not. And when Sloan came to him, he handed her 2 years of the truth without hesitating and became the technical spine of the case, the credentialed veteran who could stand up and say, "This is not how you prepare a car," and be believed. And there was a young data analyst, a woman named Imani, who had joined the team, idealistic and grown sick at what she was made to help hide, and who fed Sloan the telemetry Kane's people thought was locked. They were again the small people in the world's accounting, a veteran engineer and a young analyst and a frightened mechanic and a decent, weak golden boy. And they were the ones who brought Victor Kane down, because Kane had spent his whole career making sure the powerful were on his side and never once imagined that the people under him, the ones he treated as instruments, were keeping the receipts. And in the grinding months of that war, the thing between Damon and Sloan deepened past the point where either of them could pretend it was only the fight. It was the way she came to Ray's garage, and Ray took to her an owner's daughter who knew her way around a valve cover and told her the stories about Damon as a boy that Damon would never have told her himself. It was the way Damon learned that Sloan still kept her father's old stopwatch in her pocket at every race, and that she had come back to a team she could have walked away from because it was the last of him. It was the night they realized they had both separately been sleeping badly for weeks over the same fear that they would fail, that Kane would win, that the truth would stay buried, and the realization that they were carrying the identical weight made it somehow lighter. Neither of them said the word for what it was. They didn't need to. It was in the fact that when Damon imagined crossing the finish line first, at last in a car, nobody had rigged the face he searched the pit wall for was always hers. The season came down to the final race, as these things do, and the final race was where they sprang it, because Sloan had understood that the moment had to be won. Victor Kane could not spin, and there is no bigger, less controllable audience in the sport than the championship finale. The plan had 2 halves, and they had to happen in the right order. First, Damon had to win the race, not finish well. Win outright undeniably in the compromised car, so that the whole world watching would see with their own eyes what Victor Kane had spent a season insisting was impossible. And second, in the aftermath, with the world's attention at its peak, and Damon standing where Kane said he could never stand, Sloan would reveal everything, the sabotage, the pattern, the brake assembly, the witness, all of it to an audience too large and too engaged for Kane to control. But Victor Kane, sensing that the season had somehow slipped out of his hands, that his photograph had become a threat, that his golden boy had gone quiet and strange, made one last move. And it was the most dangerous one, because he did the thing he had done before. 2 nights before the finale, Sloan's inside sources told her that Damon's car was being prepared off schedule again by the same indebted mechanic Petro alone at night. Kane was going to do it again. He was going to make sure the photograph did not win the finale by making sure the photograph did not finish it, and this time, having gotten away with it once, he might not stop at a survivable failure. They could have gone to the authorities, but they had no proof yet that would stop the race, only a pattern and a suspicion, and Kane would simply deny it, and the sabotage would be buried, and Damon would take the risk unknowing. So they did something else, something that turned Kane's own weapon against him. Sloan went to Petro, the frightened, indebted mechanic, not with an accusation, but with a way out. She knew from the records that Petro was drowning in debt, that Kane had exploited exactly that Petro was not a villain but a desperate man who had been made an instrument. And she offered him the thing Kane never would, a way to save himself: protection. A clean record, help with the debt in exchange for the truth. And for one more thing, that instead of sabotaging Damon's car, Petro would document on hidden camera Victor Kane instructing him to do it. Petro, who had not slept since the brake failure, who had watched a man he sabotaged nearly die and been unable to live with it, agreed because the guilt had been eating him alive, and Sloan had handed him the first exit he had been offered from the trap Kane had built around him. So on the night before the finale, Victor Kane, confident and careless because he had gotten away with it his whole life, met with Petro in a quiet corner of the facility and told him in his own words on a camera he did not know was running exactly what to do to Damon Ellis's car, and exactly why, and exactly what would happen to Petro if he refused. And then Petro did not do it. He prepared Damon's car honestly, perfectly for the first time all season. And Damon Ellis went to the grid of the championship finale in a car that had not been rigged against him, carrying for the first time everything he actually was. The race was the thing Damon had been born under a train line to drive. Freed at last from the invisible weight of a compromised car, released into a machine prepared honestly, Damon Ellis did not merely win. He drove a race that people would talk about for a generation, a display of car control and mechanical feel and sheer will that answered lap by lap every lie. Victor Kane had told about him passing Chase Ashworth cleanly on merit, while the Golden Boy, racing honestly for perhaps the first time, gave him the room a real competitor gives, and finished second without complaint, and crossing the line first in front of the largest audience. The sport assembled all year, the kid from nowhere, the photograph, the diversity hire, the man they said had put the car in the wall, winning the finale outright in the very team that had spent a season trying to bury him. The paddock erupted, and the win on its own was already a devastation for Victor Kane, who had to stand in his own garage and watch the driver he had publicly called a publicity stunt take the checkered flag on merit in front of the world. But the win was only the first half. The reckoning was the second. Sloan Whitaker had prepared the ground with an engineer's precision. In the aftermath of the race, with the world's cameras trained on the finale and Damon standing in the place Victor Kane had sworn he could never reach, Sloan brought forward everything. She had the season-long pattern of sabotage documented from the maintenance logs, the parts and the mileage, and the cut setup time. She had the raw brake pressure trace from the crash, the clean copy Kane did not know existed, analyzed now by independent engineers who confirmed the assembly had been made to fail. She had Chase Ashworth, the Golden Boy, willing at last to say publicly that he had heard Kane's people talk about keeping the second car in its place, that his own results had been a gift and not an achievement. And she had the thing that ended it beyond any spin or denial or lawyer's argument: the recording of Victor Kane in his own voice on the night before the finale, instructing a mechanic to sabotage Damon Ellis's car, describing exactly what to do and exactly why. There was no surviving that. A pattern can be argued. A brake trace can be disputed by paid experts. A witness can be called disgruntled. But a man's own voice on camera ordering the sabotage of the car of a driver he had already nearly killed once, and then blamed in public, is the kind of proof that ends not just a career, but a life as it was lived. The sport's governing body, presented with the recording, had no choice and no desire to protect him. Victor Kane was banned from the sport permanently, the kind of ban that has never been lifted. The authorities took the recording as well, because ordering the sabotage of a car at racing speed is not merely a sporting offense, but a crime, an attempt to cause exactly the catastrophic harm the brakes had nearly caused already. And that was a matter for courts and not stewards. And Victor Kane, who had spent his life certain that his money and his relationships made him untouchable, discovered that a man's own recorded voice is a thing that money cannot reach. Petro was protected as Sloan had promised, treated by everyone who mattered as what he actually was, a desperate man Kane had exploited, who had found the courage to turn on his exploiter. And his cooperation and his hidden camera were the reason a dangerous man was stopped and he was allowed to keep his life and his trade, and in time to work honestly in the sport he had nearly been made to poison. Chase Ashworth's confession cost him the myth of himself, and he took the loss like the beginning of the man he had never been allowed to become, walking away from the Golden Boy identity that had been handed to him and starting over further down the grid in a car, no better than anyone else's, to find out at last whether he could actually race, and the finding out made him, for the first time in his life, real. And the team, her father's team, came back to Sloan Whitaker because, with Victor Kane banned and disgraced and facing the court's control, reverted to the family, and Sloan took the thing her father had built and that Kane had poisoned, and she began the long work of making it again. What Arthur Whitaker had meant it to be a team that raced on merit, that prepared both cars honestly, that took its talent from wherever talent was actually born. Including from under the train lines of neighborhoods the sport had spent a century locking its doors against. The ones who had stood with her did not go unrewarded. Frank Osai, the veteran engineer who had kept an honest log through 2 poisoned seasons, became the team's technical director. Free at last to prepare every car the way Arthur Whitaker had taught him, and he wept without shame. The day the new regime made honest preparation. The first written rule of the workshop, Imani, the young analyst who had fed Sloan the locked telemetry, rose fast in a team that now rewarded exactly the integrity Kane had punished. They had all been the small people, once the instruments, the ones who kept the receipts, because no one was listening, and they became the backbone of something their old principal could never have built, because a team like a car is only as sound as the honesty of the hands that prepare it, and Kane had never understood that the corners he cut were structural. She built it with Damon. Of course, she built it with Damon. He became her lead driver in a car, prepared honestly at last, and he won again and again, because he had always been able to win the whole time. And now the world got to see what a season of sabotage had hidden, that Damon Ellis was one of the greatest to ever do it. But he became more than her driver. He became, over the seasons that followed, her partner in remaking the team. Because Damon was not only a driver, he was the engineer from under the train line who could feel exactly what a car needed, and Sloan was the engineer's daughter who could build exactly what he felt. And together they made the Whitaker team into something the sport had never quite seen, a car developed by a driver who understood it from the inside and an owner who understood it from the workshop. And it was very hard to beat. They started something else too, with the team's winnings and Sloan's inheritance and Damon's growing fame. A program that did the one thing the sport had never done, that went looking for talent in the places the academies never went. The street circuits and the grassroots karting tracks and the garages under the train lines, and gave the kids it found there. What Damon had never had: real equipment, real backing, a real seat that was not rigged against them, because Damon had never forgotten that he was one of maybe 1,000 drivers, as gifted as he was, who had come up under a train line, and that he was the only one of them the world had ever let through, and only barely, and only because he had survived a man trying to kill his career, and possibly him. He meant to make sure the others did not need to survive anything. He meant to open the door. Damon and Sloan married in the off-season in Ray's garage under the elevated train line, because Damon would not have had it anywhere else, and because Ray, who had taught a skinny silent kid to feel what was wrong with the machine, was the man who had made everything possible and deserved to stand where it had all begun. The whole team came the honest mechanics who had hated what Kane made them part of and were free of it now, and Petro came, and even Chase Ashworth came further down the grid and happier than he had ever been pretending to be a champion. A train rattled overhead during the vows the way it had rattled over Damon's whole childhood, and everyone laughed, and Ray gave a toast in which he said he had spent his life fixing engines that other people had given up on, and that the best thing he ever fixed was a boy the whole world had given up on before he ever got started, and that he had known the first time the kid rested 2 fingers on a valve cover and told him what was wrong before the engine even ran, that those hands were going to take him somewhere. No one in that neighborhood had ever been, and that he was only sorry his sister Damon's mother had not lived to see how far. Victor Kane had said into a paddock full of cameras that real drivers come up through the academies and the money and the families that have been in the sport for generations, that they do not come up off street circuits in neighborhoods as you would lock your doors driving through. He had been wrong about the most important thing a man can be wrong about, which is where greatness comes from. It had come in the end from exactly the place he despised, from under a train line, from a garage with no money and no right parts, from a man who had learned to feel a machine breathing because he could not afford to experience it any other way. And that man had taken the sport's biggest stage and won on merit. And then, with the woman who read his hands and believed the data over the powerful man's story, had ended Victor Kane so completely that his name became a byword for the thing the sport most wanted to forget it had once allowed. Damon Ellis raced for another decade at the top of the sport and won more than his share, and every single time the cameras found him on a podium. Somewhere in the crowd was a kid from a neighborhood the sport used to lock its doors against, brought there by the program Damon built, watching a man who looked like them and had come from where they came from stand at the very top, and understanding for the first time that the door was open, and that it had been opened by a man who was once told he was only a photograph, and who had turned out to be the whole picture.